Welcome to the Rider Magazine Insider Podcast. I'm Greg Drevenstedt, Editor-in-Chief at Rider Magazine. Today's episode focuses on lane splitting, a controversial topic for motorcyclists. Also known as lane sharing or lane filtering, motorcyclists tend to be strongly in favor of it or adamantly against it. Last year, Arizona became the fourth state to legalize some form of lane sharing, joining California, Utah, and Montana. Because there are so many misconceptions and myths about lane splitting, I asked Rider's resident safety expert, Eric Trow, to write a feature about it, which you can find in the June 2023 issue of Rider. Eric lives in Pennsylvania, a state where lane sharing is prohibited, but he has spent a lot of time riding in California and Europe and has experience with lane sharing. His feature is titled Split Decision, and it provides a fair and balanced approach to the topic. As for me, I'm much more biased in favor of lane splitting. I think it's the ultimate freedom for motorcyclists, and it's a widespread practice all over the world. The United States is one of the few countries where it is mostly prohibited or heavily restricted. Eric and I have a lively discussion about lane sharing, and whether you're for it or against it, I hope you enjoy the episode. Thanks for listening, and keep the rubber side down. Eric, welcome back to the show.
Great to be here, Greg.
Awesome. So what we're going to talk about today is lane splitting or lane sharing. Also includes lane filtering. We'll get into kind of what the distinctions between those two terms are, or those several terms are. But I just want to say that, this is a controversial topic. Basically people are either strongly in favor of lane sharing or they're adamantly opposed to it. And I kind of want to go into the details of what you can and can't do in certain places, but also kind of dig into why some people might be opposed to it when I'm somebody, I'll just say right up front, I'm 100% in favor of lane sharing, but I also live in California where it's the state that has allowed it for the longest. It's been acceptable, even if it wasn't codified in law. So let's start in the beginning. And first of all, you've been writing the Riding Well column in Rider since 2008. You run the Stay in Safe Advanced Rider Training Program. In 2013, you received the AMA Outstanding Road Rider Award. But you also live in a state where lane sharing is not permissible. So let's talk a little bit about your approach to, you've written a feature for the June issue of Rider and kind of how you approach this topic.
Sure. And this is, and just so everybody's clear as well, I mean, my brother lives in LA. He's been there for years and years. And so way back, I don't even want to say how many years ago, that I spent a summer out there and was working and riding and commuting and doing all that sort of thing. And I learned back then the value of, or first of all, the concept of lane splitting, and then the practice of it. And it was a little nerve-wracking at first, and then you really got to see some of the advantages of it. And every time we have been back, it's a practice that is common there, and it's something that can be done, I believe, can be done safely, and that it's a good option as long as you do it right. And it is interesting to see how it's changed a bit through the years. I've definitely noticed that mirrors have become much bigger than they used to be, especially with SUVs and so forth. And our motorcycles tend to be a bit bigger too, so more so than the BMW R75 that I was running at the time. My GS is much wider. But anyway, it is something that we can't do here in Pennsylvania. And but yet it's done all over the world. And, you and I have both ridden overseas, and the hardest part is coming back and not being able to having that freedom to really move through traffic efficiently.
Right. Well, let's start by defining some terms, because as I said at the beginning, some people use the term lane sharing, some people say lane splitting, some people say lane filtering. There's the term white lining. So let's start with lane sharing. That's the most general term.
Sure. So lane sharing is something that, at least the way I wind up defining it, and it seems to be commonly done, is lane sharing. Motorcyclists do this all the time. You can share the lane with another vehicle. And quite frankly, in many states, you can share a lane with another motorcycle, but you cannot share with another car or with a car or something like that. So two motorcycles can be in a lane, whether that's, staggered or side by side. Lane sharing, just in general, is what it sounds like, which is you're going to share a single lane with another vehicle. And there are very few places where you're allowed to do that with a motorcycle and a car, truck, whatever other vehicle there is.
Okay, so that's the general idea of everybody's going in the same direction. You've got vehicles.
Yeah, good point. We're all going in the same direction.
Exactly. Yeah, so it's typically, and again, so this has got to be, you've got to have more than one lane in a single direction of travel. So let's say that you're on a city street. It's got to have 2 lanes of traffic going in each direction so that you can ride between those lanes. You're not going to ride on the double yellow, and you're not going to ride on the shoulder, though in Hawaii, that is one place where you're allowed to do that. We'll get to that in a second.
Sure.
So you've got at least 2 lanes of traffic in one direction. You're riding between those rows of cars or trucks. So essentially, if you're not riding right on the white line, you're basically sharing a lane. And some roads, and they vary in width, whether it's freeways or city streets, some are wider than others. And as you mentioned, some vehicles and motorcycles are wider than others. But so lane splitting, so lane sharing is just that activity.
More of a general term. Yeah.
That general activity. So what is lane splitting?
Lane splitting is, people do use the term splitting kind of generally too, but really lane splitting specifically, and even from a legal standpoint, it winds up being, once again, multiple lanes going in the same direction, typically highway or freeway. And it is being able to move through traffic that is traveling under the speed limit, and you are able to maneuver through slow moving traffic at a speed slightly higher than the flow of traffic. So you're literally splitting the lanes of moving traffic as it's moving forward. This is what you see in the freeways in California on a regular basis.
Right. So, I mean, I'm sure everybody's seen photographs, or if you've ever been to California, just gridlocked traffic on huge, 6-lane, freeways, interstates, the infamous 405, whatever it may be, highest volume freeway in the United States. So it's just a slow crawl of traffic, and motorcyclists, and it's typically, let's say you are in one of these freeways that has many lanes. You're typically between the 2 leftmost lanes, which are typically called the number 1 and number 2 lane. Right. So you basically would be as far left as possible, away from exit ramps, on ramps, all that sort of stuff. And a motorcyclist can basically just travel down that line between those 2 rows of cars, between the number 1 and the number 2 lane.
Yep.
One thing I will point out, in California, as we have in some other states, we actually have HOV lanes, or carpool lanes, as they would call them.
Right.
And in some places, those carpool lanes, it's the innermost lane, so number 1 lane, and it's separated from the other lanes of traffic by a double yellow line, or sometimes 2 double yellow. So, and what that double yellow does, it almost sort of creates a little extra cushion, and it almost creates what becomes on heavily trafficked freeways in California almost a default motorcycle lane.
It's a mini lane.
Yeah, exactly. So you see CHP officers on motorcycles, you see guys on big Harleys with ape hangers, you see guys on sport bikes, anybody that's a commuter, all kinds of motorcycles. So that is lane splitting, where you're basically on a limited access freeway and all the traffic's moving. And then, so what is lane filtering?
Filtering is, and this is the practice that you're starting to see in other states now in various forms. Lane filtering is, think more intersections where you are in built up areas where you are, traffic in this case is stopped at a light, for instance. And that allows the motorcycle to filter up through to the front of the line to be the first one out at the intersection. And again, part of the purpose of all of this is to help eliminate, it's not just to allow motorcyclists to cheat, it's a nice benefit that we have, but it also helps eliminate some rear-end collisions. We can talk more about that when we get into some of the pros and cons of all this. But it's a nice way to be able to get up through traffic to the front of the line so that you can then safely pull out once the light turns green. But it's stopped traffic.
Absolutely. Okay, so lane filtering is more, city streets, intersections, and you're basically you're going between rows of other vehicles to get kind of to the head of the line, so that you're kind of getting up to pole position. As soon as the light turns green, you make sure the intersection's clear, and then you can kind of pull ahead.
Right.
So there's, I guess, questions, and again, California is the state where some form, and lane splitting is the type of activity that has been allowed in California for decades. But it was in this legal sort of gray area. It wasn't legal per se, but it also wasn't illegal. And so it was a permissible activity. But in 2016, California finally codified it into law that it's in the rule book. It's in the motor vehicle statute. But that followed a series of studies by UC Berkeley in 2015. So I guess the question is, there are certainly advantages, and we'll get into more of these in terms of what lane sharing offers for motorcyclists, but also traffic in general. But I guess the number one question is it safe?
Is it safe? Safe in and of itself might be, as just even riding in traffic. Is it safe? Well, we try to make it as safe as we can. So I would call it, I think it's safe to say it's safer than what a just regular commuting in traffic. Some studies done by the University of California, Berkeley, as you mentioned, they specifically looked at the incidence of crashes related to lane splitting in California. And the big thing that came out of that is for those riders who were not lane splitters, there was a relatively high or almost disproportionate incidence of rear end collisions to the motorcyclists who were stuck in traffic behind other vehicles with really no place to escape to. And one of the things that, this is certainly what I associate with California freeways, for instance, is you talk about how it can be crawling. It can also be going 70 miles per hour and then go to 7 miles per hour in no time. I mean, right. And so there you get this tremendous change in speed. So if you have traffic behind you that's approaching quickly, but you're stopped because of the vehicles in front of you, you're really vulnerable. Right. And that's what the studies indicated, is that's where those were happening. And as a result, there were also then, they get into the injuries as well. And that's where you're getting into head injuries and some torso injuries and leg injuries and things like that. So it's pretty serious stuff if you're rear-ended, especially at speed, simply because you were sitting in traffic and doing the conventional thing. Conversely, what they found is they looked at, for lane splitting riders versus non-splitting riders, those incidents of rear end collisions, practically went away. They just dropped completely off the radar. The only ones that were getting rear-ended were being hit by their fellow riders who were riding too closely when they were splitting lanes together. So that's something we can talk about when it comes to some tips. But at the same time, it does present some new but lesser risks. So you have, there are some aspects of it, for instance, that when you're going between cars, we always talk about establishing a safety cushion around the bike, around us. It's a little tougher to keep a decent safety cushion when you're between vehicles. However, you do have the opportunity. There's some predictability when you're in between them that there's not going to be a ton of movement. It's more when you get gaps and things like that you have to watch. So the biggest threat to the lane splitting rider is another vehicle changing lanes either up ahead or beside the rider or into the rider. Right. From an injury standpoint, though, even if you're dealing with that, they're significantly, the upside is they're lesser injuries. They tend to be more almost stop and plop types of things, or some less severe injuries. But as always, in many of these cases, that's all stuff that's predictable with some active observation and some anticipating and putting yourself in the right place.
So in terms of being safer, as you're suggesting, you're less likely to have a rear end collision because you're no longer sandwiched or trapped between the front and rear bumpers of other vehicles. Because, if you think about a traffic lane, if you're in, rush hour traffic, stop and go traffic, if you're on a motorcycle, you're probably either, in the center of the lane or, in one of the wheel tracks, but you're basically inside the width of the bumper that's in front of you and the bumper that's behind you. So right. It's interesting you mentioned the safety cushion. So lane splitting can reduce your safety cushion from the sides because you're going between rows of cars. But it increases your safety cushion in front of you and behind you.
And behind, yeah.
But if you're in what is the normal situation for most people in most states, is you're stuck in traffic and you're following a vehicle and you've got a vehicle behind you, and you can try and maintain some space in the front if you can. But sometimes if there's just a little bit of extra space, somebody will change lanes and fill that gap. Yep. You have no control over how close the person is behind you. So your safety cushion is probably also, in normal traffic, when you're not lane splitting, your safety cushion is compromised from the front and the rear and not the sides,
And no matter how hard you try.
Exactly.
In those instances. Yeah.
And I know what we talk a lot about drivers being distracted, and especially with smartphones, nobody can put them down. Nobody can resist the urge to just check Instagram or whatever it is, especially when there's moments where you've just got these moments of like boredom. So you're standing in line at the grocery store or you're sitting in your car at traffic. And so the distracted driver is the one, as you mentioned, when there's this kind of slinky effect with traffic where you're going 70 miles an hour for 5 minutes, and then all of a sudden it goes to a crawl. If somebody's not paying attention to what they're doing and you're basically got that car behind you, you're more likely to get hit from behind, and that is the true danger, because there's no such thing as a minor fender bender with a motorcycle. Almost right. You go down, there's going to be damage to the bike, possibly damage to the rider. So the Berkeley research that you cited suggests that if you are lane splitting and if you're doing so in a safe manner, and we'll get into that, which is below a certain speed,
That's the biggie.
The speed differential between the motorcycle and the surrounding traffic is as low as possible, 10 to 15 miles an hour. They're not just ripping through traffic. That they're less likely to have rear end collisions, and if they sustain injuries, they're less likely to be severe, and there's also fewer fatalities. So that is, basically, if practiced in the appropriate manner, lane splitting in traffic is safer than not lane splitting in traffic, at least in California.
Yep. And you hit on the biggest, we talk about things like, hey, you want to make sure that you are observing and anticipating. But the biggest factor in all of this, and the studies, the Berkeley study indicates this as well, is speed differential is one of the greatest factors as to whether lane splitting lane splitting in particular is a safer practice or you're adding more risk. The greater the speed differential, and that's simply a matter of how much faster are you going than the traffic around you. It makes sense that the faster you're going, and the greater that differential is, the more risk that you have, the less time and space you're going to have to work with to execute something safely. And so, that's the biggie. And that's one of the things that's frustrating to me is when I have been around, and I'm sure you still see it in California, is you get the responsible lane splitters who tend to be commuters. They're guys who they're out there every day and they're riding their motorcycles and they're dressed properly and the whole bit, and they're keeping a nice, responsible speed differential, and it's working for them. Then you get some other guys that are just blasting through. And not only there's that right off the bat is they just don't, if anything happens, they don't have any room to work with at all. And that's obviously where injuries could become more severe too.
Well, I will just say that I've lived in California since 2005, worked for the magazine since 2008. I used to commute almost basically 25 miles each way from my home to the office, and I would go down the US 101 freeway. I've been lane splitting a lot. I've had to do lane split for an hour at a stretch or 2 hours at a stretch, going through I live north of LA to go down to the south of Orange County to go to an event. And there's the LA greater area just is an area that has heavy volumes of traffic. There's just millions and millions of people. So, and so, I've seen it all. I've seen, people ripping through. And it can be, the sport bikes, cruisers, people that, if things get a little bit tight, they rev their engine, they honk their horn. There's always bad actors in any situation. But like I said, most people are, typically it's just a way to more efficiently. You can take a 2-hour commute and cut it in half or even less by lane splitting on a motorcycle. And again, as a person in California seeing thousands and thousands of cars stuck in gridlock every day, I'm like, hey, this is legal. Why don't more people ride motorcycles in lane split so they would have half as much time to commute, But let's maybe talk about the fact that it is not only is motorcycling a skill-based activity, but it can be a little bit nerve-wracking, as you said earlier, to ride between cars. And so to even do it safely requires a pretty high level of skill and situational awareness.
Yeah, well, there's no question about that. And it's not for everybody because, or at least it's not for a rider who is uncomfortable in traffic, is not comfortable necessarily or confident in their skills and their ability to handle a motorcycle, because it's not something you want to do when you have certain anxieties right off the bat getting into it. And it has to be done. To be done safely is something that should be done as calmly as possible, with as light a touch as possible. And again, that comes with part of the state of mind as well as the ability to really operate the motorcycle proficiently too.
So part of what prompted this is, I asked you to write a feature about lane splitting or lane sharing for the magazine. It'll be in the June issue of Rider, and it'll be on our website soon enough. So after California finally codified lane splitting or lane sharing into law, it seemed that several other states followed in succession. So Utah passed legislation that allowed some form of lane sharing. Montana passed legislation in 2021, and then Arizona passed legislation in 2022. I know Hawaii has this sort of like one special case. I don't know when they passed whatever they passed, but I kind of find it a little bit of a special case. So we'll maybe come back to that.
Yeah.
But what prompted this was after it was about a year ago in 2022 when Arizona had passed its legislation. We posted an announcement on the website. Actually, the AMA put out a press release because the American Motorcyclists Association supports lane sharing. You basically, as a safe riding practice. The Motorcycle Safety Foundation, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. I don't know if I got that name right.
Right.
Who am I leaving out? Were there any other motorcycle organizations?
Yeah, there is one more.
Motorcycle Industry Council?
Yes, it was MIC. Yep.
Okay. The only major organization, but again, they're not motorcyclists, is the American Automobile, AAA. You know,
Yeah,
they
AAA.
practice, but they drive cars. So, so I guess the question is, so since more states have started to allow this practice, and when, like I said, when we posted the announcement about Arizona on our website, we got a ton of comments on that web post. And basically people, that's what really opened my eyes to the fact that people are either strongly in favor of lane sharing or they're strongly against it. There wasn't much middle ground. And what was obvious by reading some of the comments is you have people that are writing with no personal experience with lane sharing. They're basically like, hey, you shouldn't do this. I've never done it myself. I mean, they don't come out and explicitly say it, but in the context of their larger comment, you can tell they've never done it before, but they still think it's something that people shouldn't be doing. So to me, it's like helmet laws. It's like the Darksiders article he did about people putting car tires on the back of their motorcycles, is that there's a lot of myths.
After you mentioned that, now I'm going to get those emails again.
It's like there's a lot of myths and misconceptions about this, and what you've done in this feature, and that's what we're talking about this in the podcast, is provide some clarity on the practice and the subject and it as a safe practice. So let's dig into a couple of these states. Like, what can you do and not do in Utah, Montana, and Arizona that you can or can't do in California?
Sure. And by the way, I'd love to revisit too at some, maybe once we get through that, I'd love to go back to some of the polarized perceptions of this, even amongst motorcyclists, and chat a little bit more about that. But, California, first of all, when we talk about lane splitting, California is the only state where lane splitting is legal on the freeways, on the highways with moving traffic. In Utah, motorcycles can travel between the lanes of stopped traffic, not slow moving traffic, but stopped traffic. And that would be, again, multi-lane road with a speed limit limited to 45 miles per hour or less. And the bikes can only go 15 miles per hour maximum. That's not the speed differential. That's the fastest they can actually proceed through that stopped traffic. Well, I guess that is the speed differential if they're stopped, but yeah.
So that would essentially be, they've allowed a form of lane filtering. So you can't do it on the freeway. Yep. This would only be on city streets, basically where there's, and again, more than one lane of traffic going in each direction. So at least two or more lanes. But basically all the cars have to be stopped. They can't be moving at a slow pace. And the motorcycle that is filtering its way through traffic, presumably to get to the head of the line at the stop sign or the traffic light, is basically cannot go any faster than 15 miles an hour. And the speed limit for anybody can't be above 45 miles an hour. 45. So again, so to me, that's a very sort of specific set of guardrails or parameters that allow for this practice in Utah.
Yep, absolutely. Okay. So then the next state along was Montana. Very, very, it's similar, except that they're similar but different. So here riders can go between lanes, they can filter between lanes and overtake stopped or slow moving vehicles that are traveling no more than 10 miles per hour. So the flow of traffic is limited to 10 miles per hour. And then the motorcyclist has to stay within 10 miles per hour of that surrounding traffic and never exceeds 20 miles per hour. Okay. So it's not a lot of math, but
right.
Didn't know. Yeah, to do this, you have to know a little math. But the bottom line is, you're not going over 20 miles per hour. Traffic can be up to 10 miles per hour, and you just have to stay within 10 miles per hour of the traffic, and that's a safe speed differential. So that's actually a relatively safe practice right there, and gives the rider more flexibility than in Utah, where everything has to be at a complete standstill. You mentioned Arizona, and that's where it's once again, it's stopped traffic at a red light on a multi-lane roadway. Similar to Utah, speed limits 45 miles per hour or less, and the rider can travel no more than 15 miles per hour. And there's no passing on the median or shoulder. So in essence, Arizona and Utah are aligned from that standpoint.
Now, Hawaii has a special case where you can't actually do lane filtering as we've described it up to this point, lane sharing, but they allow you to what?
Well, this is where they give you the opportunity to pass stopped traffic again on road. These are all multi-lane roads, and but you can use the shoulder provided that it's wide enough to accommodate the rider.
Okay.
Now, frankly, this is one that I wish every state immediately, this is the first thing that I think should be allowed. This is, imagine the long stop traffic. It can be for whatever reason that everything is stopped, just allowing motorcyclists the opportunity to respectfully go around the traffic on the shoulder. But that's what you can do in Hawaii. Now, having just ridden in Hawaii on the Big Island, I don't find a whole lot of wide shoulders there. So, it's really limited as to where you can do that. But it's certainly something. But what this shows is these states, they're adopting some form of this, but in various ways. And again, I think it's important for riders to recognize this didn't just open the floodgates and make it possible to just work your way through traffic like you can in California.
Right. Well, the reason I wanted you to kind of spell out the specificity of these laws is that, it's not like lane sharing is like a light switch. Either it's on or it's off. You can or can't do it. Now, let's just take a moment and consider, you mentioned at the outset that you and I both have ridden in other countries. I've done lots of press launches and overseas tours, mostly in Europe. I know you've done the same. You've been in Europe. I've also been in other countries. The interesting thing is in other countries, lanes sharing is pretty much, I don't know what the laws are, but my experience is it's pretty much a free-for-all. It's kind of like you can do whatever you want. You can also typically, anywhere you can put down a kickstand, you can park a motorcycle on a sidewalk. But the practice in these other countries is ingrained in just like lane sharing or lane splitting is not just allowed, it's almost expected. Like you as a motorcyclist are taking up space on a freeway or on city streets that is unnecessary if you're not working your way through traffic. And it's it is just accepted as what you do, as that is because you have this small little maneuverable vehicle. It is your right to just slice through traffic, whether it's again on a freeway, on city streets, to move to the head of the line at a traffic light or something like that. And it's just so there's not whereas in this country, even though it's I find that these states like Utah, Montana, and Arizona feel like they're dipping their toe in the water. Let's see what we can safely sort of see, and let's see if this blows up in our face. But generally, it feels like Americans are opposed to the idea, almost like it's culturally, like you used the word cheating earlier. Like they think by motorcyclists filtering or lane splitting, you're cutting the line or you're cheating because they think that, well, I'm stuck in traffic, you should have to be stuck in traffic too.
Yeah, and that's it's interesting. I was just thinking as you were talking about that I mean, would you agree that motorcycles are more part of the culture in a lot of these other countries than it is here? Here, I feel like we're still an us and them type of environment. And we do have an interesting sense of, I can't think of another word besides entitlement, as, we feel it's our right to drive. It's actually a privilege, but we feel it's our right to drive. We feel, people talk about, as a matter of fact, I do own the road, this idea of everybody's got a sense of ownership of the space that they're in on a highway. And motorcyclists are guilty of this as well. But if we're suddenly infringing upon somebody's space that they perceive to be their own, or that you're doing something that they are feeling is not permissible, it's not appropriate, then in these areas, especially out of ignorance and a lack of empathy, because many of them aren't motorcyclists, then they act out and can kind of punish you, and that can be a dangerous thing. And that's why I actually think that, especially in these new states, and any new states coming, is a campaign of some sort, an informational campaign, public service, that lets people know that this is a legal practice and that it's an acceptable thing, and know these people aren't just trying to screw you over. That's going to be a beneficial thing, because until we have that, it's still going to be an us and them thing.
Well, you make a good point, is that even in a state like California, where not only is lane splitting permitted, but in much of our state, we can ride year round. We just are fortunate to have weather that allows us to ride year round. You can commute year round. Is that even in a state like ours, where we have a huge number of motorcyclists, is it still fairly rare? Like in the United States, motorcycling is still typically a recreational activity, whereas, for example, in Europe, and especially in many other countries, particularly third world countries, motorcycles are utility vehicles. They may have a motorcycle instead of a car because they can't afford a car. It's expensive to park a car in cities or something like that. Is, as you said, they're much more common. Scooters, motorcycles in European cities and other countries.
Absolutely.
So, but they are still a rarity here. People still think that, it's a rebellious activity. It's a weird activity. And something that you mentioned in the feature, you quoted from Tom Vanderbilt. He mentioned this idea of this empathy imbalance, where basically we view the world through the lens of being motorcyclists. Other people don't. And so they don't see what we do the same way we see what we do. Does that make sense?
Yep. And Tom, but you mentioned Tom Vanderbilt he's the author of Traffic, Why We Drive the Way We Do, which is one of my favorite books. It really gets into the psychology of drivers and driving and all the reasons we do the things we do, and addresses some of these things in terms of senses of entitlement and how we react. And this empathy and balance thing I thought was fascinating. And now Tom is not a motorcyclist, but he is an avid bicyclist. And he was using his instance as well as saying, look, most drivers, while they may have ridden bicycles when they were kids, they aren't active bicyclists on the road, and commuting. And the same thing with motorcyclists. They're not motorcyclists. They don't understand. Therefore, they can't have an empathy for the motorcyclist world, including what risks you're facing, what your mindset is, what your intent is, why you're doing what you're doing. And so they may see what you're doing as a motorcyclist in lane sharing as being, you're cheating, you're cutting in line, you're breaking the law, you're being rebellious, and it's all negative feelings, because they don't have the ability to naturally empathize with it, because it's not in their world. It's not something they're accustomed to.
What I find fascinating about that is, even though people are in their cars or trucks, especially these days, SUVs, pickup trucks, they're in very large, we call them motorcyclists, sort of condescendingly call them cages, even though we all own one and it's our grocery getter and so forth. But like a motorcyclist lane splitting isn't going to do any damage to a car. I mean, I guess it could clip a mirror or something, but it's not going to cause personal injury to somebody that's in a car. But you mentioned earlier about some people feel like, well, maybe they're crowding my space, that I feel like it makes me nervous. My wife is one of those people. She's commuted on the 101 here in Southern California for many years. And even though I'm a motorcyclist, I'm a lane splitter, I've done lane splitting with her on the back of a motorcycle. She just gets a little spooked every time one would come by, her car. Is that, it's just not something that it seems like, well, hey, that's not a full lane. Why would they be doing that? Even though the motorcycle fits through there. So the thing, I mean, we talked about the injuries and the safeness, but some of the advantages of lane sharing is that it effectively it doesn't reduce the number of vehicles on the road, but it does reduce the number of vehicles that are stuck in traffic lanes.
That's right. Yep.
So, I mean, even though like people think that we're cheating or cutting the line, hey, listen, if a motorcycle is lane splitting and goes past you, you're still stuck in traffic, whether they are behind you or go past you. Like, they're not making your commute worse by lane splitting. They're actually, if there were enough motorcyclists, they would be making it better, because it reduces total traffic congestion.
Yeah. And think about it this way too, is all the motorcyclists that may be ahead of you in all of that line, if they are stuck in line with you, you're farther back now.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
That's, for me, I just want to, I mean, if it's not obvious, I'm a Californian. I've done a lot of lane splitting. I'm a strong advocate for the practice. I know that you are, in this sense.
I didn't pick up on that. I'm sorry.
Is that, like you said, since you don't live in a state that allows it, though you have spent plenty of time riding in other places, it's safe if done safely, if it's done properly. And so as a safety expert, I understand you have a measured approach to the practice, and that's exactly why I asked you to write the feature that you did, and I think that comes across very well. But, for me, I think it's one of the things that what we talked about at the outset, and what I want to, that you said we should come back to, is what really baffles me is the fact that so many American motorcyclists that live in states where it's not allowed oppose the fact that anybody does it anywhere. Like, they think that you're crazy. Like, why the heck would you do that? It's dangerous. You're going to kill yourselves. And that is the part that really frustrates me, because it's not based on experience. It's based on myth or just assumptions or misunderstanding of the practice.
I do think there's a lot of that. I'm going to try to give them a little bit of the benefit of the doubt and say maybe it's a matter of, because I think about here in Pittsburgh, and Pittsburghers are incredibly kind people. They're really friendly and everything else, unless necessarily you put them behind the wheel of a car. Then things happen a little bit differently. It can be a situation, and like I said, trying to give the benefit of the doubt, saying, hey, when I have done something, anything, I get a negative response. from other drivers. And I just can't even imagine why anyone would try to introduce that component, because they're assuming then that people are just going to be so pissed off and so angry about it all. The other thing too is, I mean, it could be like, I think about here in again, in the Pittsburgh area, where none of that is legal. But I've seen riders splitting lanes, and it's usually a handful of riders, and they're doing it recklessly. They're doing it at high speed. They're going much faster than traffic, scaring other drivers and riders, zipping in and out of lanes. And they even do it in the tunnels here. So, maybe that's also stirring up some of maybe that's their perceptions of what lane splitting is. And as I mentioned before, is like, well, what does a lane splitter look like? And this is in the story, is well, what they look like tends to be they're commuters wearing all the right gear, tending to ride solo and riding responsibly. And it's not kind of the image of what you may see. But then again, there is definitely the aspect of, there are people who just simply say, man, I can't imagine doing that. And so therefore, that's what a crazy idea that would be. And I sense, quite frankly, I think the photography, for instance, for this feature is terrific. And some folks, when they see the sea of cars and the motorcycle coming down through, might be immediately overwhelmed by that and say, oh my God, how could you do that? But until you experience that and see how it works, and in California, one of the things I think is beautiful is it works almost like a zipper in many cases, where car drivers tend to be aware, and it is a cooperative thing for the most part, where they'll actually create space for you, provided you're not zipping through, that you're giving them time to notice you and giving them an opportunity to respond, because you're treating each other respectfully.
Yeah, what's interesting is motorcycles always have it's mandated, they always have their headlight on, as that,
Mm-hmm.
as you're coming down a long lane of traffic, people, if they're paying attention, will look in their side view mirror and they'll see that headlight, because they're not expecting to see it necessarily. It's coming down the lane. And I have a lot of experience with this, where people will drift over to the left to basically create a little bit of a wider space for you. And it's very common among lane splitting motorcyclists to just, wave a hand to just sort of acknowledge that, hey,
Yep.
thanks for giving me a little extra space.
That goes a long way.
But there are motorcyclists, again, there's always the bad actors. There's always people that are going to abuse a privilege. There are motorcyclists who feel that because they're lane splitting and because they're Joe Badass, that they feel that cars and trucks should be like parting the Red Sea, where they should just open a big space for you. And if they don't, if for some reason, some people just crowd the line, they do whatever,
Sure.
it's just, that's just how traffic is, and some people drift over the line a little bit. They're just not paying attention. They're kind of clueless. So some motorcyclists will rev their engine, they'll honk their horns, they'll make all kinds of gyrations to try and like provoke riders and say, hey, you're drivers. So hey, you're supposed to get out of my way. No, it's not the cars or truck drivers' job to get out of your way. It's your job
Right.
to find a space if one exists. If it doesn't exist, you come to a stop and you wait, and traffic will start moving and things will open up. So it's a give and take. And the way that I approach lane splitting personally is, it's up to me to make it happen in a safe way. And so I can't force
Or
myself
not happen.
or not happen. And I can't force it to happen, because in any confrontation with a car or truck, I'm going to lose. They are a couple of tons at least, and I'm on maybe a 500-pound motorcycle, and I'm going to lose. So I basically don't want to provoke anybody. But, and the thing is that I find interesting about the lane splitting is, there are tons of people in California that are motorcyclists that don't lane split. Just because it's allowed doesn't mean you have to do it. It's unlike a helmet law or a seatbelt law where it's mandated for everyone. This is an allowed practice, but if you aren't comfortable doing it for any reason, don't do it. It's perfectly fine.
Yep. You brought up something that I think is interesting to consider. We were talking about, there are times to do it, times not to do it. And that's all, quite frankly, that's even a matter of, if you go to your favorite road and you want to strafe the canyon because you just absolutely love doing it. But if there's a situation that is just not right, don't force it. And it's the same thing with this. It's like, I'll save that for another day when it's safe to do so. Same thing with the lane splitting is, if you're in a situation where, okay, this isn't cooperating, things are too tight or what, and it can just be a momentary thing, to just, like what you said, is you pause, you wait it out. And if you have to get back over into a lane, you can do that at any time. That's the other part too, is you're not stuck in the middle forever,
Right.
in between lanes. You can move over into lanes at any given time too. But the idea of just using your best judgment, and that's where I feel that what your motivation is for the lane splitting, I think is, or lane sharing of any kind, it comes down to, it shouldn't be impatience. It should be efficiency. It should be doing the right thing. It should be a safety decision, quite frankly. But as soon as it becomes about impatience or frustration, now you're adding another element and becoming your own worst enemy. And that you're now raising the risk at that stage of the game. And that's where, again, I find it interesting that the study shows that, I described that these are riders who tend to wear all the gear and they're riding responsibly, they're riding solo. What I didn't mention is most of the lane sharing and lane splitting in California is happening during regular commuting.
Right.
And that's where I've said before too. Now, an advantage of that is also you're dealing with what I call professional commuters. So you have even your car drivers, they're accustomed to a pattern and so forth. So initially it may be odd for someone to have a motorcycle coming up through, but when they're commuting every day, it becomes a regular occurrence. And I think that's probably why you get that nice zipper effect that works to the favor of them. And this cooperation, because that's what happens with people who commute on a regular basis.
Well, and the interesting thing is, having and lane splitting, I will say it's like any other skill-based type of motorcycling. You were talking about riding in the canyons, if you maybe want to do that at a spirited pace. Yeah. Well, that requires a certain skill set in terms of braking and throttle and body position and all those sorts of things. Well, lane splitting is the same thing. Like when I was introduced by lane splitting by a friend of mine. I first moved to California. We're going for a ride, and I basically followed him on a freeway as he started lane splitting. And following another person, it's sort of like I've ridden in countries where everybody drives on the left side of the road, and it's like if you're by yourself, it feels really weird. And if you pull out of a gas station, you're going to maybe do the muscle memory thing and go in the wrong lane. But if you follow other people, it feels pretty natural. So I followed a friend. It was a little bit weird at first because I felt the space on my sides where it feels differently when the cars are in front and back of you. But it actually very quickly felt pretty natural, and it felt liberating because everybody's stuck in traffic but us. It's like we got a free pass to basically go through traffic, and while everybody was stuck. But the thing is it took me a while to get comfortable with it. As I think one of the things that you quote Lee Parks, who runs the Total Control Clinic, he runs the rider safety programs for California and other states, is motorcyclists have to be skilled. And you talk about this in some tips. Like you have to be an experienced motorcyclist. You have to be able to be comfortable in the density of traffic. You mentioned that earlier. You really have to be able to be comfortable with emergency braking and swerving and stopping and anything in that sort of situation. Can't be impaired, shouldn't be drinking if you've, on medication, anything like that, anything that's going to impair your reaction time or judgment. But if you, like anything else, as you do it more often, like whether you ride on a track or you ride in the canyons, I feel like I've developed kind of a spider sense for cars. Like you can see in their side view mirror, you can see a bit of hesitation that suggests they're looking for an opening in a lane. You see a little bit of a drift towards something. And the number one thing that lane splitters in California have to look out for is basically a gap, where basically there's going to be a car-sized gap that is your lane splitting. Somebody, and people like to abruptly change lanes to fill a gap because they know it won't be there for very long. So those are the things that I always am most cautious and use cars as kind of a blocker. If I see a gap there, I slow down to make sure it's not going to get filled. And once it closes up a little bit, I can go past. But it really is something that you can develop a sense of comfort with, and a skill set that is, and a lot of it is based on perception and judgment of other vehicles are doing, because they tend to be rather predictable.
Yep, I completely agree. And it's amazing. I'm sure you have this sense now too, like you say, the spidey senses. You can predict what's going to happen before I think even the other drivers know what they're going to do. If you are observing far enough up ahead, you see that gap, and you see there's a photo in the story too. There's a car up ahead. It's following a truck that's surely it's having difficulty seeing around. There's a gap to the left of it. Naturally, you think, I bet you that driver might want to get around to be able to see around that truck, or at least get around that truck. Well, the motorcycle's approaching. You can't expect, so you're anticipating that and making sure that as you get close to where that gap is, you're prepared for that. It is interesting that it's heightened input, heightened things going, number of things going on around you, but it's an oddly Zen-like thing that you get into where you can do this very calmly and very smoothly and everything. And it's, to me, this is almost like same thing with cornering you were talking about before. when it feels like work, you're doing it wrong. So when you're doing the lane splitting, and if you're like all tensed up and everything, you're making abrupt moves and all that, okay, the technique is wrong. Settle it down, breathe, and it does not have to be a stressful thing at all.
Well, and weirdly, I guess it's some people talk about a flow state. Others would just be that because you have obstacles and things in your immediate surroundings that you've got to sort of focus on and evaluate in real time. To me, it keeps me very present moment focused. I cannot be distracted and thinking about other things. And so anything, whether you do jigsaw puzzles or you do yoga or you do lane splitting, whatever it is that kind of keeps you in that present moment is actually a fairly satisfying state to be in. And like you said, it can create, even though it's a heightened awareness and laser focus, it's also can be a weirdly calming sort of thing. You can kind of stay in the moment and be very focused on what you're doing. So, but let's just step back again. It's not for everybody. If you're somebody, and not everybody can evaluate themselves that well, but if you're somebody who is easily spooked or panicked, in challenging situations, if your situational awareness, you have a hard time staying focused or concentrated, whatever it might be, those are not, if you're that type of person, lane splitting is probably not for you, or lane sharing, lane splitting. So, I mean, and you and I talked this earlier, is that I think the times I've seen how uncomfortable people are with lane splitting is I've been on some overseas tours where some of the participants are Americans who have never lived in a state where lane splitting was allowed or lane sharing was allowed. And we'd be as a group and we're, let's say, approaching a hotel in Madrid or Lisbon or one of these major cities. And it's just expected that there's a ton of traffic, and to efficiently get to our destination, we're going to go between rows of cars on a freeway or on city streets. And people that have never done it before get really spooked and kind of freaked out. I've been, had everybody kind of, it's like a duck and her ducklings. Everybody follows the ride leader. But once you get there, everybody takes their helmets off and they're panting. They're kind of freaked out. They're like, oh, I don't know if I would ever do this. But again, that probably reflects more their lack of experience than the actual danger that they were in.
Yeah. And I think, there's something to be said. That'd be an interesting conversation in and of itself, is the idea of, I like to encourage people to break through their comfort level, the edges of their comfort zone, versus throwing them into it. So one of the pieces of advice that I have is don't let somebody talk you into doing that. Now, when you're on a tour like that, you kind of have no choice. Those are tough situations. And although I will say in that case, you have professional tour leaders who are setting a pace, they've been through this a bunch of times and everything else. I don't know how much setup there was in preparing people for it, but the thing that I would advise people here is to say, hey, look, if your buddy's splitting lanes and you've never done it and you're uncomfortable with it, then use your common sense. Do what's right for you. Ride your own ride. And then if it's a matter of saying, okay, I want to know more about that, let's talk about that. And then maybe they can show you. But if they just start doing it and you go, oh, I need to follow them, that's not an ideal scenario.
Right.
You had mentioned something earlier that I just wanted to add one more thought. And that is, I think there's a strong argument that lane sharing, lane filtering, lane splitting actually puts you in more control as a rider. It's easy to look at that and say, well, why would you thrust yourself into that environment? Well, again, if you're just stuck in the lane, you are more vulnerable and you can't do anything in terms of the traffic ahead of you. As soon as you get in, I just want to reinforce that idea that really it's an opportunity to put yourself in greater control of the situation. And you were talking before about the decisions that you make and what you decide to do. It's a very dynamic process, but it is one that you're less likely to be a victim of something, because it forces you to, or you've made the option to kind of take control of the situation by going slightly faster than the traffic around you.
I 100% agree. And one of the things that we didn't really mention is that, again, in a typical situation where you're in traffic on a motorcycle and you've got cars or trucks, one in front of you and one behind you, you can only see the vehicle in front of you. You can't really see around it very well. But when you're lane splitting, you can see all the way down the lane because you're looking between the rows of cars. So your sight lines are much, much farther ahead. So you can see
and scanning across multiple lanes.
Whereas, especially if you're behind a big Suburban or a delivery truck or something and you're in traffic, you're basically looking at a wall. You can't see around it. You can't anticipate anything. So I 100% agree is that you have a better understanding of your environment and visual awareness of what's going on.
Yeah, you have command of that. Yeah.
I think the thing that people just again, it's sort of like, I guess, if you're right-handed and you tried to write with your left hand, the idea that somehow they're acclimated to having vehicles in front of them and behind them, but riding single file between them where they're closer on the sides, because we typically don't, it's not necessarily a safe practice to have two motorcycles riding side by side in the same lane.
Right.
Even though
Mhm.
you see, some motorcycle cops do it and it's kind of that sort of thing. I never ride next to another motorcycle in a lane
Why give up that advantage? Yeah.
exactly, because anything you want to do. So I think somehow people just feel it's weirder, but like you're just trading one set of constraints for a different one. And I think since you're traveling in a longitudinal direction, having the additional space ahead of you and behind you,
Yeah.
it gives you the additional control that you're talking about.
Absolutely. I was just thinking when you were talking about having that visual, for instance, you mentioned before on highways, if you're doing this, you do have on ramps and exit ramps to put yourself in a position where you can actually see. And I bet in your riding, you can see this all the time, is you see the merging traffic and you can anticipate and you can watch vehicles starting to shift left. And you can see how that can potentially affect you moving forward long before you even get there.
Absolutely.
Which gives you, once again, you have greater control of the environment, greater command of the environment, and can.
So I think, again, it may not be an activity that is advocated for everybody. And again, it's only really the lane splitting is the one we're talking about with the freeways. It's only allowed in California. For me, I personally feel safer. Because based on my experience, now, yes, I've had some close calls and lots of situations, but again, riding in a lane just like a car doesn't mean you're not going to have close calls. You're going to have people stop suddenly in front of you and you're going to have to brake hard. You're going to have situations where hopefully nobody bangs to you in the back, but I've known plenty of people who have been rear-ended on motorcycles. I don't know anybody who's had an accident lane splitting. Nobody do I know has been rear-ended while they're lane splitting. Again, I've actually seen one guy who was riding a little bit too fast on a sport bike. And again, he went past a gap just as somebody was going into it and got clipped by the quarter panel of the pickup truck.
And that's an avoidable scenario.
Again, that could have been avoided. As you well know, as a safety expert, almost any motorcycle crash or incident, I don't want to call it an accident, can be avoided, as most of them can. And again, one of the things that is, I think one of the myths is that people think that cars are out to get them. Like they think, well, somebody could just open their door. I'm like, who opens their door on the freeway? Like, even if they're stopped, I mean, I guess, every now and then somebody stops at the traffic light, will hop out and, hey, I need to go get something out of the cooler or something like that, out of the trunk. But the thousands and thousands of miles that I've done lane splitting in California, I've never had anybody open a car.
Yeah, I think
open a car door. So
yeah, I think the idea of, it is a defense mechanism or a precaution, I guess, to say if you assume everybody's out to get you, but in reality, frankly, you just don't matter that much to them. You and I were talking about this before, is the toughest thing is, are you even on their radar? Let alone are they out to get you? No. And again, especially if you, just as in any scenario, the rage comes when you treat each other without respect. And that's why I love the idea of the little thank you and so forth, is just the courtesies that you show each other. And it's, that the next time they see a motorcycle, they're going to be more willing to help it out because, you can be an advocate. And one of the things that I want to make sure that we cover too is a little bit of, there are some tips, and we've kind of talked about some of this stuff, but some of the things that if you are going to do the lane sharing is, I just want to reinforce that idea of the speed differential is one of the most important things. So that's why I actually like the rules or the law according to the rules of that. For instance, motorcycles not to go over 10 miles per hour over the speed of the traffic around them in some states, for instance, or 15 miles per hour, that there are some parameters and they're there for a reason. So keeping the speed just slightly faster than the traffic around you is what's going to be the safest practice. You already mentioned that idea of looking far ahead and being hyper observant and anticipating the movement, especially near open gaps where drivers can shift lanes. And the big thing to this is we want to respond versus react.
Right.
So we can see what's happening up ahead, and if we can then have a response to it, that's a safe practice. Reacting is where things get a little bit hairy. Part of this is being tactical ready. So that just means, aware and ready to be able to move. That can be a sideward movement of the bike. It might be acceleration. Cover your brake and clutch in that scenario is a pretty good practice. and be ready to do things calmly along those lines. Breathe. I think that's one of those things I remember having to say to myself when I was first doing that, is like, oh my gosh, you haven't breathed. Breathe
Right.
and relax, stay calm, and keep a light touch. And would you say too is avoiding, the blind spots, especially maybe with some of the bigger vehicles?
Well, certainly hanging out in anybody's blind spot is not such a great idea. Again, I think of lane splitting because that's, but though lane sharing is, I mean, lane filtering is allowed in California, where at least I don't know, I don't know what's the law. I actually don't know specifically what the law says in California, but I've done it in streets of Los Angeles and various
Mhm.
places, and I think because the police allow the activity is, so I've done lane
It's very
filtering
flexible. Yeah.
and splitting, and it seems to be acceptable. Is that sometimes you use the other vehicles, as I mentioned earlier, kind of as a blocker. If there's
Blocker.
if there's a gap, I might hang back for a second, and especially if you're in somebody's blind spot, but they can't really go anywhere because there's another car next to you. You can
Right.
kind of use other vehicles as barriers. I mean, actually, Quinn Redeker, a former motorcycle officer,
Hmm.
was talked about this as one of his strategies. Is as you're going through intersections, sometimes to use a car as as a blocker. I mean, in the sense of, is if you've got a car next to you, is there's less likely to be hit broadside. Basically
Yeah,
deep
I do it all the
intersection.
time. Yep.
Because you're like,
Absolutely.
hey, this is my most vulnerable, is crossing through an intersection completely by myself, where somebody could turn left in front of me or blow a red light or something. And so if you're riding right next to another vehicle, at least just to get through the intersection, not for very long, just enough
Yeah,
where, hey, they're going to see that, because they may not see you, but they'll see the pickup truck or they'll see the sedan or whatever.
absolutely. Right.
So yeah, so blind spots, yeah, I don't want to stay in them, but is you kind of use other cars to your positional advantage, or to create an additional barrier to prevent people from doing things. Most people don't swerve into other cars, if they see them. And these days, it's funny, every time I'm lane splitting, I see the little light that comes on in everybody's side view mirrors. Now that everybody's
Yep.
got the blind spot sensors, you see the little orange light flash on, and everybody's like bing, 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 bing as it's going down. So yeah.
I just rented a car recently when traveling out west, and I, I drive older cars at home, and driving this new one, and it was amazing where it's steering me out of the way now.
Yeah.
It's they're starting. Not only is the light there, but it's like, no, 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 you're too close, and it starts to correct for you.
Right. Right.
So interesting.
Any other tips? I mean, again, the idea is that you've basically got to be an experienced and safe motorcyclist. Period. I mean, that's kind of the given. If you're somebody who's an inexperienced, for example, if somebody's learning to ride, whether you're in California or somebody else, I wouldn't advocate somebody lane splitting any more than I would say, yeah, you should have a passenger on the back. I think you really should have.
Yeah, give it a good season of.
Yeah, you've had some training, you've had some experience. And as Lee Parks, you quote him in your feature, he basically says, all of the, operating the controls of a motorcycle should be muscle memory. It shouldn't be
Absolutely.
something that you have to be thinking through, like, oh, when am I supposed to shift and do operate the clutch? If you're still trying to get that mapped out in your brain, you shouldn't be lane splitting or lane filtering. So yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yep, without a doubt. Nor for me, hop on an old Triumph with this shift and brake reversed.
Right, exactly. Well, I mean, one of the things that we touched on a little bit, and you talk about this extensively in the feature, and I think it's an important consideration, is that part of the challenge that any lane sharing motorcyclist has is the lack of understanding by most other drivers on the road, cars,
Yep,
trucks, whatever. Most of them aren't, very few of them are motorcyclists. Very few of them understand lane splitter, even in California, where it's been a pretty accepted practice for decades, even if it wasn't codified in law. If you're a commuter, if you've been on interstates or freeways or whatever, city streets, you've had motorcycles lanes share, lane filter, lane split past you before. But in other states, especially where they're just rolling out this legislation, as you said earlier, there really needs to be driver education,
absolutely.
public service announcements, whatever it may be. Boy, I think that's going to be an uphill battle, but I certainly hope these states are budgeting for that as part of the process of rolling out these programs.
I think it's key, and that was another thing. Lee Parks brought up the same thing, and my head's been there as well. I think I gave you an example of it's not lane sharing, but it's a different thing. For instance, and you may want to cut this out, who knows? But in Pennsylvania, the double yellow, we don't have very many passing zones in the entire state of Pennsylvania. It's really kind of odd. But what you do have is the double yellow, I believe it's the only state, the double yellow is actually an advisory. It's not a mandatory no passing. It's no passing if there is a posted sign that says no passing, and I think it's like a mile after that.
Right.
But otherwise, it's actually, you can pass where it's safe to do so. Now, of course, that's also up to the judgment of law enforcement. I don't particularly like that practice. I'd much rather say, okay, let's make the passing zones and get them in there and everything. But my point is this: most of the vast majority of Pennsylvania drivers and visiting drivers have no idea that that's actually what the case is. So if in some scenario where you even do that safely, you can run into drivers who now are once again feeling cheated. They're feeling as though you're breaking the law. And in many cases, people want to play cop and they want to do something to make sure that you know that that's not approved of by them. So there's a good example of something that it's never been publicized that is, that the double yellow is an advisory. Same thing with now, if lane sharing becomes a legalized practice and nobody knows about it, except for the motorcyclists, that really works to the disadvantage of the motorcycling public. So I just think it serves everybody well to make sure that there is a campaign,
right,
and that, or at least organizations within the given state would step up and do whatever they can to inform drivers that, hey, this is okay. And this actually can work to your benefit as well.
Well, there's a story I was going to tell that I've been reluctant to tell but it sort of illustrates, I think, this point about the public perception. Because so a number of years ago, I was at a press launch in North Carolina. It was when there was the solar eclipse. So that was in August. North Carolina gets really hot in August. So we had been riding the motorcycles. We had been in a location where we were in the zone of totality, where it was basically total darkness for 2.5 minutes, whatever. So that was a Monday, and it was the sort of thing, because it was such a rare event, lots of people just took that day off and they just they drove to wherever they could to get within this path of this solar eclipse. And so we were in North Carolina. We were not too far from Asheville, and we had gone to this location. We saw the eclipse, and then we're riding back to our hotel in Asheville. And because everyone had taken the day off, and these are fairly small country roads, even though there was these divided highway with 2 lanes each, it was just absolute gridlock. We're on big touring bikes. They're getting really hot. Our ride leaders are all former police motor officers. And so they're basically like, hey, we got to get back to the hotel. And so we just slowly kind of formed a line and started lane splitting between 2 lanes of traffic. Now, everybody had been, for a 2.5 minute event, everybody had taken the day off. I think there had been lots of tailgating. So there were folks that had probably not that sober in their cars. But I'll never forget, literally crawling through traffic. And again, it wasn't allowed in North Carolina. So again, it's hard to say that we were clearly in the wrong in that situation. We shouldn't have been doing it. But we were it was, again, hot bikes, we got to, overheating. We got to get out of here. And I was rolling past a minivan, and a woman who was driving the minivan, and I could see the kids in the car, leans out the window and yells at me, "F you, mother effer," blah, 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 just screams in my face about what we're doing. And everybody else had stories about somebody threw a bottle at somebody had a gun pulled on them. It was just like, it was this like pandemonium kind of thing. Eventually we were able to get off to an exit, because that's what we were trying to do, to get to the nearest exit and take a different road. But I was just absolutely shocked that people were so hostile to us, because again, whether we were lane splitting or not didn't affect how stuck they were in traffic. We weren't forcing them to stop or taking up space, but they were actively hostile to the activity that we were doing. So again, that was not really what we were doing wasn't really right. But at the same time, I felt that the reaction to the activity was blown way out of proportion relative to what we were doing. So
yeah. Next time you tell the story, you should probably say, "This friend of mine."
Well, I was in a group, so anyway,
this guy I knew.
I'm not going to identify but just as an example of like, that's why I find it, again, in the United States, as I said earlier, to me, lane splitting, lane sharing, it's the ultimate freedom. It really is, because we have these small maneuverable vehicles. Why shouldn't we be able to just work our way through traffic, again, safely? Anybody that does anything dangerous, obviously you're sort of like outside of the bounds of what's acceptable. But it's, whether it's where you park them, where you ride them, and lane filtering, is that our vehicles are more fuel efficient. They take up less space, and it's kind of a reward for those virtuous features of motorcycles. But again, it just seems to be an ingrained opposition in the psyche of many Americans. And again, you go to some other countries, they don't even think about it because it's just what you do. It's not.
I'm sure
they
they
even
would
contemplate.
be. I'm sure they would be baffled by how difficult it is here.
Yeah. So,
Yeah.
well, Eric,
I can't wait to hear the responses.
well, again, I mean, what really prompted this for me, it was just the idea that motorcyclists like to embrace the idea of freedom and escape and being able to sort of enjoy the open road, and that there are motorcyclists that really would actively want to advocate against this activity, even though it's been shown to be safer. And in certain states where it's legal, they still think you shouldn't do it. I'm like, hey, listen, if you don't want to do it, that's fine. If you live in California and don't want to lane split, you live in Utah, Arizona, Utah, Montana, don't want to lane filter according to those rules, that's fine. Don't do it. But I don't think you ought to curtail the freedoms of others especially if it's an allowable practice, if it's a legally mandated or, legislated practice.
You hit on an absolutely key thing, and that is by putting it into law does not make it a requirement.
Right.
That it's a choice, it's a tool that you have, it's something that's available to you, and I can't see the opposition to that.
Yeah,
and the research supports it,
right,
that it's a safer practice. So,
well, I appreciate that you have a national reputation, decades-long reputation on safety. You worked with Larry Grodsky, who had a stellar reputation on safety. You're someone who, based on the facts and also based on your personal experience, is that if done in an appropriate manner, it is a safer way to travel through traffic for motorcycles.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore, hey, there's and again, supported by the AMA, supported by the MIC, supported by the MSF. It is, these organizations understand, and the AMA has a sample or model legislation that other states can be introduced as bills, and other states are considering it. Oregon got pretty close. I think Tennessee got pretty close, but it's one of those things that the motorcycle lobby is not big in a lot of states. Therefore, the advocates have the minority voice. And I think the status quo of, well, let's just do this, let's not allow this because it seems risky, even though the research shows otherwise. They're like, well, we're just safer by not allowing it. So, and that's unfortunate.
Yeah, and so hopefully in time that will evolve. I will I mean, as you know, where it's permissible to do so, I do it because I believe that it's practical and it's a safe practice, again, if done properly. So
awesome.
Yeah, well, hopefully someday I can do that in the East here, because
yeah,
I hate the idea of having to. I love Southern California, but I hate the idea that I have to travel there to be able to have that flexibility.
I agree. Well, thanks for all the effort that you put into the feature. I think it's great. Everybody take a look at the June issue of Rider. We have a digital edition. We have a print edition. We'll have the feature will be on our website at some point. Yeah, I think it's going to stir the pot a little bit because, there's people are very strongly opinionated about things. I think you, again, presented the subject and examined the practice in a fair and balanced manner. I'm more biased, and I admit as much in my column with the magazine, but I'm exercising my freedom. I'm doing what's allowed in the state of California. This is a weird state. It's typically, if it's not mandatory, it's prohibited. So to have this freedom in this state is it's weird. So it's like the golden ticket. But again, I think that it's something for people to think about. And hey, yeah, maybe it could come to your state soon. So
yeah. Well, thanks again for the opportunity. It's good to be talking with you again. I really appreciate the opportunity to put that on the table. And I think discussion and debate is always healthy. So looking forward to that, awesome. The response that we get.
Great. Well, hey, everybody, thanks for listening for the Rider Magazine Insider Podcast. I'm Greg Drevenstedt. Thanks for listening, and keep the rubber side down. If you've enjoyed listening to the Rider Magazine Insider Podcast, please subscribe, leave us a positive rating, and tell your friends. We also encourage you to visit ridermagazine.com, where you can get the latest in motorcycle news and reviews and sign up for our free weekly newsletter. You can also subscribe to print and digital editions of Rider Magazine, which is published 12 times a year. Thanks again for listening.